I have a confession to make. Father, forgive me for I done goofed. You see, in my efforts to become the greatest YouTuber ever conceived by God, I have made one crucial error. I've become the thing I swore to destroy. A hater. There may still be hope, my transformation is far from complete, but I've made some hatin'-ass videos in my time, and by God, some of them were my favorites to make. I mean, this is bad, guys. I can feel my life force slipping away, my joints tightening, my urge to make a video about why the post-Endgame MCU sucks heightening. Oh boy, what a unique idea. Better write that one down. Oh, wait till they hear about the hot takes I have about Thor: Love and Thunder. But as I sit here atop my judgmental throne, I have to admit, there's been a voice in the back of my head, the final remnants of what I assume is this so-called humility that people are supposed to have. And you know what it says? Like you could do better. Like you could do better.
My own words rang in my head like a bell inside a head.
And you know what? Eventually it got to me, you know? I sat around I'm up here now. Can you please? I sat around thinking, man, I'm really making fun of Redfall, Enchanted Portals, Gotham Knights, acting like I'd be so much better at game design. You know, I'd be like the guy who seems tough, but is actually just bringing out the most potential out of everyone. Like, Jeremy, get those sketches in by 4 p.m. Justin, I'm gonna need 6 enemy types by Tuesday. Mariah, bump up those frame rate numbers. But hey, guys, most importantly, have fun out there. Right, dude, oh my God, I'd be so good at this job. But the truth is, I've only ever developed a single half-finished 2-minute vertical slice of a vapid Hotline Miami ripoff. I've just never said, okay, it's finally time, let's go all in on a project and see how it turns out. Usually I just give up halfway through. I'm simply not built different. But that all changes right now because I decided it was finally time to commit, and not just to one project, no. I was gonna make a brand new video game every single week for 6 weeks. 6 games, all with different themes, prompts, gameplay loops, everything, with a hard deadline every week, after which I'd publish the games on itch and then not touch them forever. A personal challenge set by me with no motivation besides finally getting over my excuses and learning how to actually design games. And also so I wouldn't fail my game design course, which is the actual reason why I did this. It was totally mandatory. I had nothing to do with it. What was nice about this though is that each week would have a specific prompt and goal that kind of reined you in and asked you to focus on a small element of design, which helped not overscope things. He said, knowing full well that he overscoped every single project in this class. Also, you get to work in small groups, which you might think is cheating and makes this less impressive, but A, if you're gonna do this, it might actually be better if you do it in small groups because learning that dynamic is really important. And B, I had like other classes and like research and stuff. Like realistically, I spent like 3 out of 7 days on like each of these weeks, so it evens out, okay? Anyways, in this video, I'm gonna be talking about the design philosophies about some of these games, the challenges, the successes, and then in part 2 of this video, because yeah, it's gonna be 2 parts. Clearly, I'm not gonna be concise. I'm gonna go over the rest of the games, some of the stuff I learned, some of the things that you might be able to learn if you're aspiring game dev, I guess. So yeah, it was a bit of a rough ride, but I have a lot to share, so let's get into it. Week 1's prompt was to design a minimalist game using only basic shapes and a single button input to play the game, and that's not exclusive of the arrow keys and WASD. I'm talking one single button. I have to admit, I walked out of that class feeling pretty good about myself. This can't be that hard, can it? It's a single button. Plus, I just made a whole video about designing simple game mechanics around seemingly unremarkable concepts, and that one video already made me an expert on this stuff. I was gonna crush it. We were all put in groups of 3, I started planning out everyone's roles, some of the basic idea, and then before we could even start, my dream was shattered because both of my group mates immediately dropped the class. I don't know why, like maybe I smelled like stinky that day? That's almost definitely why. Either way, I was now down to a one-man show, but I wasn't gonna let that stop me. The one positive here was that I guess I now have full creative control, so I started thinking to myself, what kind of games have minimalist gameplay? You know, not necessarily just one button, but typically a low number of inputs. Well, point-and-click games for one, some puzzle games are mechanically simple despite presenting complex problems, games where you organize or sort things, stackers, runners can be pretty simple. Old games like Tetris, Tetris and Pong, but condensing a lot of those down to a single input felt a little bit tough. I thought I'd be compromising a lot of the fun doing that, or maybe making something a bit too derivative. Eventually though, I did land on something that felt like it had a decent amount of potential, a rhythm game. Rhythm games can be just about as complicated and challenging as it gets, but they can also be pretty simple, mainly because they rely so heavily on timing, which is a somewhat intangible element. You do need at least one button input to prove that you're matching that timing, but outside of that, it's really just the rhythm itself doing the heavy lifting. The demo for Unbeatable, for example, really just has an up button and a down button to hit incoming projectiles, but it's fun, stylish, and has a really interesting assortment of songs that make it something I revisit pretty often. So alright, first goal down I guess. Think about something until something happens, and to keep the victories coming, another guy actually joined the class and was added to my group, so I at least had a partner now, and guess what? He was down to make a rhythm game. Alright, things are looking good again. We are so freaking back, baby. There's no way things could possibly go. It went wrong right away. You see, in my infinite wisdom, I thought to myself, I like parries, right? What if this was a rhythm parry game? It's fine. I can just say words and they'll magically come together as a cohesive idea. So the pitch was this. You're fighting a boss. Did I mention I wanted a boss fight in this game? Yeah, I clearly overestimated how much time I had. Anyways, you're fighting a boss and it's moving around in a circle, firing shots at a little square thing in the middle of the screen, which has, I don't know, 3 health. It shoots these shots at like a fun, snappy tempo, not necessarily a song, but an easily recognizable pattern. Your character is meant to protect this square from getting hit. You're basically placed on this circular rail system around the square and need to get in the way of the attack to block it. Now, it was around this point that the whole one button rule that seemed like a blessing at first was showing itself to be the curse that it truly was. Because if I used the button to move along this rail, then I couldn't have a button to actually time the parry, which meant that either you had to be a precog and know exactly when to move to get to this intersection point at the exact right time, and that's how you parried attacks, or you could get there as early as you like, not have to time anything, and just wait for the projectile to hit you, which would completely eradicate the rhythm element and also kind of the parry element. I did mock up a few solutions for these cases, but I didn't feel confident that I'd be able to figure it out with the time constraint that I had, given how little experience I also had. So eventually, I decided to actually make the player not directly controllable at all, and drew up a little cushion around the rail which represented a timing window. If you pressed the button when no enemy projectiles were inside of that area, it registered as a miss, brought down your score, and you wouldn't move. If you pressed it when a projectile was in the area though, your character would quickly move to the point where the projectile hit and quote, parry the attack, launching it back to the enemy. That did mean that the whole circular rail thing was more of a stylistic choice than anything, but that's okay. I still thought it was a fun play on the one button rhythm game idea. Anyways, now that I've explained my thought process and got you all on board with this idea, I feel like I did a pretty good job pitching it. I think I should also mention that it did not work. Like at all. Honestly, like looking back on it now after making so many games in the weeks that followed, it was such an easy fix, but I just couldn't figure it out at the time. I was struggling to set up the system to detect when projectiles were in the timing window. I was struggling to get the speeds right so your movement was snappy but not too quick and blurry. I was struggling with just the rotation system in general, because rotation in Unity is a bit of a learning curve. It doesn't work how you'd expect. It just wasn't happening. And so after all that time, I was straight up abandoning the idea, and at this point, if I was just doing this for myself, this is the point where I would probably just quit. I would be like, it didn't work, whatever, I tried. But remember, this wasn't a self-imposed challenge. I had a grade on the line here, and I'm nothing if not a filthy goddamn nerd, so I was not gonna fail this. And so I looked down at my watch, 3 days to go. Oh god, okay. I told my partner, hey man, I'm sorry, we're switching gears here. He said, okay, no worries. I didn't do the work I said I would do anyways. I said concerning, but somehow that worked out. Okay, backup plan. Hey, Unbeatable was one of the original inspirations. Maybe I make a similar system that launches you up or down, but using one button to do each. So it's kind of like an anti-gravity thing. Okay, but it's gotta be simple shapes, because remember, that was part of the prompt. So, okay, simple shapes, obstacles or spikes. You're a square, you move down this long rectangle, and oh my god, I made shitty Geometry Dash. I swear to god, I only noticed this on the day of the presentation, and I was very upset. But it's okay, we move on. What song should I have for this rhythm game? I know, Clint Eastwood by Gorillaz. Good, make it something that's copyrighted so you can't actually play it for this video, you dumb, stupid idiot. Alright, spikes, I feel like that's not enough. You gotta have more obstacles. I know, maybe you could be like playing sheet music. You know, you're avoiding the notes of the song instead of having to hit them. That's like a fun flip on the conventional rhythm game, right? What are you, stupid? You have 2.5 days left. Good luck making it look like playable sheet music. Okay, so we ended up with this. You have to avoid these rectangles in the middle as well as the spikes. It's not as cool as the sheet music thing, but it stemmed from the same idea, and eventually if you want to pick this back up, you could do some— oh my god, Everhood already did that! Oh my god, there's no original ideas, everything's already taken, God has abandoned you. Okay, focus, you have 2 days left. Create a small playable demo for the first few seconds of the song, play some other non-copyrighted music in the background, and shut up so people can see what you did. Okay, it sucks, but that's okay, I think. You asked your partner yesterday to come up with some obstacle patterns while you worked on building more of the core gameplay. He hasn't responded yet. Follow up. He said he's worked on some stuff, but let's talk about it more tomorrow morning. That is cutting it so goddamn close, but it's okay. Remember, you're gonna bring out his true potential. You have a day and a half left. Tidy up some timing stuff, add little gem collectibles so players are rewarded for perfect timing. Awesome, it works. Now rotate them so they look like diamonds instead of squares. Oh my god, now they're falling off the edge of the earth. Why? Oh, because you still don't understand how basic rotation works, and also for some reason, you're moving the entire level towards you instead of moving you through the level, because that's how it works in most rhythm games, but it would have made way more sense to not do that here. It's okay, you got lost in the sauce, you didn't want to change it because you had already committed, but you could have fixed it in 12 seconds looking back on it. Screw it, you have one day left, let's have that meeting. Partner says he's ready, I say I'm in the Zoom call, and then I get an email from him saying, I shit you not. Hey man, I actually did none of the work I said I did, and also, I'm dropping the class because I don't have that dog in me. Dude, I wish I was kidding. I edited literally none of that. He legitimately told me that he doesn't have that dog in him, and so he's dropping the class as I'm sitting in the Zoom call that he set up 5 minutes ago, the day before the assignment is due. So, okay. All right, whatever, screw it. Make a couple more patterns out of the music that get progressively harder. Show it again, but people still can't hear the right music.
Cantarolar o sopro do mar.
Maybach music.
Living on a limb and I'm blowing him boss.
All right, there's definitely something wrong with the timing, but speaking of timing, you have no time. There's half a day left. Okay, make a presentation, upload the game to the itch page for final submission. Oh no, you can't see the player. Dear God, what is this horrible issue I'm facing? How do I fix it? I spent like an hour and a half trying to figure out what was going wrong here, and I just didn't put the right dimensions on the itch page. Okay, everything's up and running at this point. The timing on the itch page is even worse than it was on Unity, but I don't even care at this point. I leave as fast as humanly possible. I go outside. It's raining. I get to my class. I'm soaking wet. I sit around waiting to present for a little bit. I finally get called up. I go up to present. I realize I am in my pajamas. The presentation went surprisingly well, though. I think I didn't give myself fair expectations for this project. It was the first one. I also got bailed on twice, once at the very end, no less. I also made an entire other attempt at a game that didn't work, and I still came out with something that was at least playable and had echoes of fun. Definitely overestimated my abilities a little bit, also underestimated how hard it would be to fit into the constraints they gave, and also how to deal with something new like WebGL, which is the platform you need to export to in Unity to set something up on itch. That was something I hadn't even considered. The point is, if you are gonna do something like this, like a marathon of games, maybe set low expectations at first and then cut those low expectations in half. I'm gonna talk more about the platform issues I ran into in the next game, and also just what I learned here and onwards in part 2 of this series, but as far as my thoughts on this game, I think honestly Rhythm Geometry Dash, while not ultimately as original as I thought it would be when mocking it up, would be kind of fun to build out, especially if I could work on that whole sheet music idea for some good old-fashioned visual flair. I definitely have too much empty space in the game, which is something that I didn't really realize when making the game because I was so used to it that it didn't seem weird until I looked back on it afterwards. And I definitely incorporated some bad practices that I got stuck to for the sake of time, which is something that I was really hoping to avoid in the coming weeks, a goal that I never once hit. One thing I really liked about the process was that the whole one button rule forced me to think critically about how I would actually fit my idea into such harsh constraints, because honestly early on you probably need as little freedom as possible in making your game for both your own sanity and just to understand the kind of compromises you have to make during game design. Overall, I'm gonna give my performance for week 1 a 6 out of 10. It would probably be a 4 if this is what I ended up with a full group and a full week to work on it, but knowing how many wrenches were thrown into the mix, I've been inclined to cut myself a little bit of slack. Next week. Week 2's prompt was to make a game that featured at least 3 characteristics of a game, and if that sounds vague and entirely too open-ended, it was. We had gone over concepts like heuristics, entropy, and depth in class that week, and those were some of the so-called characteristics that we needed to base the games off of, but basically that just meant make a game with a lot of mechanics, or not a lot of mechanics, and then make it complicated, or not complicated, and then tell us why you picked what you did. Awesome, I have no information. Thankfully, every week we got assigned new partners, and also thankfully, the ad drop date had now passed, and so my foul stench would have to offset hundreds of dollars that it took to take this class in order for people to leave me now. And so, 1 week after I was supposed to have it, I finally had my first group meeting. This week also happened to be the exact time that Gumbrella came out, which was a game that I was pretty excited for and enjoying. And in it, there's a boss fight where you float around the screen, avoiding enemy attacks while staying airborne and shooting at this big monster. And so I came to the meeting with a pitch that took that idea but tied it around a single resource that you needed to constantly manage. You guys know I love me that aggressive healing, that offense is your defense type gameplay loop, so I wanted to make a game where you moved around the screen with a jetpack which would slowly lose fuel as you used it, but you could gain fuel back by killing enemies. You'd fight to stay airborne, and if you fell to the bottom, you'd lose. So basically just like a little jetpack survival game. Another group mate of mine had honestly a much cooler idea that was sort of a horror game inspired by PT. She had worked on a small 3D horror demo in Unity before, so she had some experience in the area, and her pitch was that you were looking for a key to open a door. The key was placed in a random room, so you had to explore to find it, and if you got too close to the end of the hallway, it would stretch out and extend with more rooms, so you're stuck in this never-ending corridor until you finally have the key. Now this was really interesting, but also, buddy, I can make a square move inside a circle. I'm not making PT in a week. Eventually, we did all agree that while her idea sounded awesome, there was just no way it was doable in our time frame, even if we used online assets, and so we did move forward with the jetpack game. And the reason I bring this all up is mainly to talk about finding your role and pitching ideas in a small dev project. Whether it's a game jam or a school project or a personal project, or you're going into the industry, especially in a small team, you need to find or define or accept your role, and that's not always easy. Now, I will admit, in all but one of the projects, we did end up going with my initial idea, and in every single one of the projects, even the one that we didn't go with that idea, I ended up being the team leader project manager. So you might be thinking, seems like you didn't sacrifice shit, buddy. It seems like you just strong-armed every single group into doing what you wanted, and yes, but maybe the real sacrifices were the friends we made along the way. Ow, what the hell? In all seriousness though, I do want to address that leadership role because I feel like it's something that everyone kind of wants, especially early on, but it's also not something that you can just call dibs on. I like to think I put in the work, you know? I'd start brainstorming during class, writing down ideas on the subway ride home. By that night, I'd have a full document outlining the mechanics, what we'd potentially have to implement, potential role designations, all before most people even started thinking about this week's project. I try to keep my ear to the ground on how people were feeling with the ideas that were being pitched. Like in the week that we didn't pick my idea, it was because I felt the lack of enthusiasm around it compared to another pitch that was sparking a lot more discussions, so I pivoted to see how we could improve that. I asked questions, I would show the same level of critical thinking and point out potential problems for both my ideas and others. I tried not to assume my idea was de facto the best possible option, but I did work my ass off from the jump to finalize a coherent pitch with a good roadmap. I think that stuff's really important, and how you actually earn those leadership roles, not just because you're talking louder and more than everybody else. Although let's be honest, I was doing that as well. Are you really surprised? It's been like 15 minutes and you've seen one actual game. I clearly can't stop talking. Back to the actual game though, honestly week 2 is going way smoother early on. I was making sure my parts were correctly organized, my code was clearly laid out with comments explaining stuff for my group members, and now that that one button constraint was gone, there was a ton of online tutorials that helped me figure out how to get basic movement and shooting working with a regular control scheme. Using tutorials is a bit of a dangerous game depending on exactly how you use them. You could easily end up learning next to nothing if you rely too heavily on them, but I think they're definitely fair game for something like this because knowing how to set up jetpack movement or shooting scripts wasn't exactly the challenge here. Most of our actual critical thinking was less in developing the functionality and more, how do we tie all this together into one solid package? And so that functionality was figured out pretty quick. I pulled some free assets from itch to use for the environment, characters, and weapons just to save time and make it look a little less basic. You can see that it looks kind of silly, but honestly we didn't want to spend time figuring out animations for holding the gun in different directions. That wasn't really the priority. Player movement was also something that was getting tweaks throughout the week because having the jetpack properly oppose gravity and feel weighty while not instantly shooting you upwards was a bit of a tough balance to strike, but the basic movement, shooting, and even jetpack particle effects were done in the first couple of days. An idea actually working right away in this economy? I know, I was shocked too. By day 3, the player could move around, dash to the side, shoot in any direction, and of course they'd have this fuel bar relegating it all. The fuel bar would be slowly depleted if you use the jetpack to stay airborne and would quickly drop if you dashed. So to stay alive the longest, you'd be best off tapping the jetpack button intermittently and maintaining height instead of holding it and staying at the ceiling, and of course, not dashing, which was easy to do right now because there were no enemies to dash away from, so let's add enemies. Luckily, one of my group mates handled that, setting up bats in this cave setting which would spawn randomly and chase you, shooting little pellets that you needed to outmaneuver or dash away from. Now obviously we said up earlier that killing these enemies was your main source of regaining fuel to survive longer, but what about when enemies hit you? We could obviously just set up a regular health mechanic, but everything else revolves around this fuel bar, so wouldn't it be kind of cool if taking damage also dropped that fuel down a certain amount, and then everything, all the punishments and the rewards, would all be focused on this one single mechanic? That would be a lot cooler, right? Honestly, I don't know. This is probably the part of this game that I'm most conflicted on looking back on it. I feel like I got a bit too wrapped up in the whole one mechanic fits all idea and didn't think critically enough about the fact that if taking damage knocks off a chunk of fuel, and then the only way to avoid that situation sometimes is by dashing out of it, and dashing also takes off a chunk of fuel, then you're kind of getting punished in the same way for both succeeding and failing. Of course, you lost more fuel by getting hit than dashing, but too much would mean a single hit damn near takes you out by itself, and too little meant that the dash punishment needed to be reduced by a lot in response, which meant that the basic fuel consumption of flying around needed to be reduced in response, and then you could hardly tell if you were losing anything to begin with when flying around. No matter what we tried, it was always a little bit imbalanced. So in retrospect, if I was to do this again, I think I might actually incorporate a more standard health system on top of the fuel gauge, but you know, you live and you learn. The rest of the week we tweaked some of the specific values, playtested a bit, played around with the enemy speed, projectile cooldowns, your reload speed, adding a wave system that made enemies faster and more aggressive over time, giving enemies random health values which were represented by their color because we thought it was quirky and we wanted a discrete health system, and then UI and sound effects. A lot of small stuff that hadn't even crossed our minds when we originally were setting out goals for this project, which leads me to another tip similar to the expectations one. When planning things out, list everything that you could very comfortably finish by the end of the week, and then take some of those things and make them optional. 99% chance you don't even get close to finishing those things because of all the extra work you need to do or the problems that rise up. But just in case, if you do end up finishing things early somehow, or you know, you want to return to it later on and have that motivation to come back to it, having a list like that is still pretty helpful. Unfortunately, we did not do this, and because we were hitting all of our mini deadlines on the way, we thought we were 100% on track to actually finish in time. And so imagine my shock when somehow, after generally breezing through everything until this point, we found ourselves still updating important parts of the game 3 hours before class. But it's okay, hey, it's an improvement from last time, right? At least you won't be there at the last minute this time and won't be in your pajamas. Except that's kind of weird. The player's fuel isn't going up when they kill enemies on the itch version of the game, even though they do in Unity. That's kind of odd, but hey, I caught it, so let me just change that real quick.
Approximately 10 hours later.
Listen, I know it happened weeks ago, but I'm still residually stressed about it now. I was trying to fix this issue until the literal minute that class started. Unfortunately, I was also doing so in my bedroom, which is 45 minutes away from campus. So as you math whizzes may have figured out, I actually wasn't set to get there at the last minute, just like I promised. I was gonna get there almost an hour late. To this day, I still don't know what the actual issue was, only that it seemed that WebGL, the platform I mentioned earlier that is used to play games on a web page, was going through things in a different order than Unity did, and that meant the exact script I'd written for the fuel increasing with each enemy kill just wasn't working anymore. I did kind of implement it a little bit strange, like I could have made it a bit more effective with one change, but it definitely wasn't weird enough to create such an odd error, especially one that didn't show up in any of the other weeks. Anyways, the only fix that wound up working after like 100 attempts doing all kinds of bullshit was to read how many enemies were on screen every single frame and then give the player more fuel when that number was one less than the frame before, which insinuates that an enemy has been killed within the last frame. It was much less responsive in giving you the fuel boost because of the death animation, but I had legitimately negative time left, so I rushed to the subway, took the train down, switched to a second train, thought, hey, I've never noticed how much time it takes between the second last and the last stops. That's weird. Anyways, I got off at the station. I took the wrong train. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm officially gonna be over an hour late. I'm freaking out. Somehow my group still hasn't been called up to present. I get to class. The only entrance is at the front of the room, so you can't sneak in. Instead, everyone's just looking at you for being literally 70 minutes late to class. Somehow I got in there before the group was called up. Then we finally were. I went up there, proudly presented the now fixed game, and was met with a lot of confused faces. You see, the one thing that we had forgotten to consider was the fact that we all knew how the game was supposed to work. We were the designers. We knew how the movement was supposed to work. We knew how the enemies were supposed to work, how the health system worked, how the fuel bar worked, but everybody else didn't. And even though it seemed simple to us, trying to explain it in the presentation felt kind of clunky and hard to follow because we hadn't set up the game to be welcoming to anybody who wasn't intimately familiar with it. We'd also gotten used to the visual style of the game and the background and the enemies, but to everybody else, it was kind of hard to distinguish the background and the foreground, so while it was clear to people that we'd made something interesting, it also didn't seem very fun. It was honestly a huge bummer because I liked how the game eventually turned out, especially for week 2 with such little experience. I felt like we made a lot of good design decisions and just made a fun game overall. But we'd packaged it so poorly that people during class and later during the group playtesting and peer evaluation stage said that they just couldn't get a grasp of the game and felt it was a little bit frustrating. It was a little disappointing, but also a bit of a wake-up call. Tutorialization is important. You should always remember that players will be looking at what you're doing with fresh eyes, so it's good to step back, clear your brain a little bit, and see if somebody can actually understand what the game wants them to understand. And once again, you probably shouldn't leave important features like menus and sorting out issues with exporting to different platforms until the absolute last minute, because it kind of diminishes your creative accomplishments when you half-ass the important logistical stuff. I think if you could have packaged this game better, I would have given it like a 7, maybe an 8 out of 10 considering how early it was, but the fact of the matter is it just didn't click with the people who saw and played it, which is what matters most, so all things considered, this week gets a 5, but I'm still pretty proud of the core experience. Week 3. Hi, it's me on a different day. I don't need to explain myself. Week 3 was the one that I was most looking forward to, level design. We talked a bunch in class about level design, particularly early level design, but these were the things I wanted to focus on implementing. 1. Guidance. I wanted to have clear but not ham-fisted guidance for the player, even if it was a little bit on the nose for now. 2. Layering. Essentially slowly introducing different threats and obstacles and then stacking them on top of each other to create more difficult scenarios. 3. Branching. Having multiple paths for the player to take, which would be combined with guidance to suggest which path would be best for you to take first. And 4. Foreshadowing. Leaving little hints about what you're about to face next, where the next key item was, etc. A game that I remembered having really unique level design as a result of its unique movement was Dandara. You couldn't actually move left and right like a typical side-scrolling game. Instead, you did these gravity-defying jumps onto specifically laid out points to go through levels that went sideways, upside down, and in spirals, with the camera turning when necessary to keep you oriented correctly. Doing something similar seemed like a fun challenge, but obviously I wanted to put my own twist on it, and at this point the idea was like a runaway train. Within like 2 hours of brainstorming, I had all these ideas and mechanics, even lore that I felt fit together perfectly. And basically, the pitch was this. You played as Albert, a half-man, half-ghost. He is a man stuck in limbo, and given his unique condition, he's able to communicate with spirits who are, for whatever reason, trapped in the physical realm. Al, your ghost side, it lets you see into the astral plane, where spirits whisper and guide you to their lost souls. But Bert, your human side, it communicates with the physical plane. He can exist and move in the physical realm, but can feel pain and can only move to his right side. Throughout the game, you move through winding levels representing the twisted minds of the spirits you're trying to liberate, always moving to your right and flipping up and down from the roof to the floor using your ghost form. Unlike Dandara also, you could jump to any point you wanted, not just predetermined blocks, but had to be careful of spikes and enemies which represented the spirit's inner demons. As a ghost, you can attack the inner demons, but as a human, they eat away at your sanity and bring you closer to death, which is really just a pretentious way to describe Goomba stomping. Your mission was to explore these levels, find a keepsake which represented why the spirit couldn't move on to the afterlife, and deliver it to them so they could reconcile and find peace. Now, ideally, this would mean that we would have cutscenes that represented those memories, and their inner demons would be matched with their trauma, and there would be dialogue that led you to these spirits, but we didn't have time for that. So the temporary solution for guidance was just to have a glowing blue light that occasionally popped up and led you into the right direction, which you could see as the spirit calling to you. Honestly, I couldn't be any happier with how things fell in place with the original idea. It felt like every thought I had kind of built off the last one. Every coincidence made the final decision seem that much stronger, and it happened so quickly. I knew this idea had way too much potential not to bring up to my group, and so I did, and they seemed on board. So I said, okay, I'll work on the basic movement today. It'll probably be done by tonight, and we can just move on from there. It took me 4 days. And it was still broken. The two biggest problems I ran into were collision detection and, surprise, surprise, rotation, my arch nemesis. The thing is, I knew I was trying to implement some pretty unorthodox movement here and was taking Dandara's concept for movement and taking it even further than they did. Not to mention the whole only moving right thing meant that we had to design very specific levels for that harsh constraint, but it still felt like it would be pretty simple in my head and just wasn't working out how I wanted it to in practice. There were plenty of issues I ran into, from clipping through parts of the environment to not being able to set up this line renderer properly, even though it seems like it should be easy, but the bugs that came with constraining this as well were pretty frustrating. But the biggest problem, which actually existed in some capacity all the way to the day of the presentation, was the game not properly detecting when it should rotate so the camera was oriented correctly at all times. This should theoretically be happening anytime the player collides with a wall side first. That indicates that you've hit a perpendicular wall instead of a parallel one, and the camera needs to turn to view it like it's the floor now. Initially, I thought of setting up every wall with a tag that was either parallel or perpendicular and turning the camera when you hit a tag that was different from the last one you hit, but that wouldn't have been a very scalable solution. If I ever came back to this, having to remember to switch wall types for future levels seemed kind of silly. It also just wouldn't play super nice with the tile maps given how their colliders work. So instead, I set up an empty game object directly to the right of the player to detect these collisions, and also one at the top and bottom to make sure that they weren't colliding with anything. And that was just to avoid situations where you land on a horizontal surface but are standing really close to a wall and you don't want the camera to actually flip. No matter what I tried though, something was always off. Some regular jumps would all of a sudden decide to launch me into a somersault, and some turns would go on forever, even with highly accurate, continuous collision detection. And not to mention it, turning the actual camera itself was causing all kinds of issues with the camera offset and the way the camera was following the player. It would just act really inconsistently no matter what I did, so I made the whole level rotate around the player. I know, if any game designers watching this, I apologize for whatever the hell I was doing. Also, in some cases, the level actually had to rotate in a different direction to orient you properly, which seems like it would be a quick fix, and it would be if I had set up my movement correctly. But the code was so spaghetti at this point that it required an equally long hatchet fix that took entirely too much time and still wasn't perfect. Eventually, I decided that I just couldn't spend all week on the movement and would try and brush it up a little bit closer to the end. It was time to move on to the rest of the game. But I think this problem really outlines both the biggest benefit of doing game jams as a novice designer and the biggest pitfall. The time crunch really forces your hand as a creative. It makes you come up with very creative solutions to very specific problems, but also that same time crunch makes it so that if you do something stupid, it becomes so difficult to justify starting over and unstupiding it that you just compound on the stupid until your game is just held together with a rubber band, cheese whiz, and pure willpower. Anyways, I moved on to work with one of my groupmates to design a couple of example levels, ones that would be entirely traversable, only moving to your right, and that meant a ton of looping. That also meant that the game was primed to feature some backtracking and foreshadowing, which we took full advantage of. In level 1 during the second half, you can see your ultimate goal, the spirit, over here, but the spike placement forces you to head down and around first, which was also conveniently the way to find the keepsake required to clear the level. In level 2, the keepsake was immediately shown to be to your left, but since you can't move left, you had to make your way around instead. Level 2 also had a lot more branching, like here where the route folded in on itself so you could just end back at the same fork if you chose wrong, or here where you could either take the path that led to the keepsake or the one that led to the spirit. The guiding light would help you pick the right path, but no matter where you went, there was always an escape route and you gained valuable information regardless. As we were designing this stuff, another groupmate was filling out level 1 with spikes and simple enemies. I had now learned from my past mistakes, something that I typically vehemently avoid, and moved some of the obstacles around early in the level so that the player would have an easier introduction to the movement system. The first stretch of this game had no danger whatsoever. You could just learn how to jump up and down in this hallway. After which you were met with a few spikes, then a single enemy, then the first rotation, which could be a little bit disorienting, so we made sure the danger was low here, and then slowly the level started stacking enemies and spikes together as you explored around, found the keepsake, and delivered it to the spirit. Filling out level 2 was more of the same and went surprisingly smooth. The mechanics would inspire the levels would affect the mechanics, we'd see how that interaction felt, and then we'd adjust the level. It was like a big feedback loop with everything down to the placement of the spikes feeling purposeful because they would funnel you into the right place. Once again though, the game's movement system was causing all kinds of weird problems. Like for example, while you could traverse the entire level by only moving to the right, there was a chance that if you made certain mistakes, you would be completely trapped. Like how landing here meant that there was no way to continue without hitting a spike, and that wasn't a problem that could be fixed with clever level design, it was an inherent problem with the game's movement. Our solution for the time being was to have a reverse button, which essentially just let you undo the jump you just made so you can go back and land in a better position, which did help this issue, but we never wound up perfecting it because of how much time was wasted earlier in the week. We did our best with what we had, but at the end of the day, the levels just didn't come together quite as seamlessly as we'd hoped. We'd had a good proof of concept, we had a good demo, a good technically 2 playable levels, but not without their issues. The week was almost over though, so we added some quick tutorialization, played around with the lighting, added a tile map, and boom, the game was done. Or as done as it would be. I do want to quickly mention though how drastically the lighting improved the atmosphere and really drove home the game's themes. I mean, this is literally night and day. I actually love the final look of this game despite it feeling so thrown together the first 6 days. I realized at the last minute that I hadn't added any music or sound effects, and so I quickly threw a couple of things in there, but I didn't want to be late for a 3rd time in a row, so I headed to class for the first time under normal circumstances and did the presentation. Guys, people love this game. I had a ton of people come up to me afterwards telling me how much they loved our game from this week. They were interested in the mechanics, they liked the backstory, the lore, they were just interested in the look of the game. It was a very vindicating experience, to be honest, so why am I so low energy on this one? Well, it wasn't because I didn't like the game. In fact, from a creative standpoint, it was probably the thing that I was most proud of in this entire marathon, but it was also the most frustrating experience from the get-go. Unlike week 1, which was a frantic panic to make something, anything, and week 2, which was smooth sailing until we got to a roadblock near the end, week 3 was draining the second I opened up Unity. I was so excited to do so many things with this idea, and it took me over half the days to even set up the groundwork, and even then, the game didn't function exactly how I wanted it to. I felt defeated as a programmer throughout this process, even though I felt good as a designer. I just wasn't coming up with efficient solutions, and it was continuously biting me in the ass. Despite the final product turning out pretty well and demoing really well, I knew how thrown together so much of it was, to the point that if I revisited the idea at any point in the future, I wouldn't just start with fixing bugs, I would entirely overhaul the whole thing, which obviously makes it less appealing to revisit in the first place. As a demo, especially a 1-week build of an idea that was sort of out there, I would give myself like an 8, even a 9 out of 10, but as the basis for a full game, it's like a 4. I do look back fondly at this project, but that week really took it out of me, so I was hoping that for week 4 I could do something a little bit more simple and take it a little bit easy for the week. But you won't know if I did that until part 2 of this video. That's right, this part's over, the 3 games down, 3 more to go. This video is way too long already. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new here, if you want to see that next one. I'll see you then. Peace.